The Susquehanna is a graveyard that refuses to stay buried, and this dam is its primary tombstone. I took the job because I needed the silence, but the silence here is not empty. It is a heavy, pressurized weight that pushes against your eardrums until they pulse with the frantic, mechanical rhythm of the turbine spinning deep in the bowels of the earth. My office is a concrete box perched over the foaming abyss, bathed in the sickly, rhythmic flicker of cold blue fluorescent tubes that buzz like dying hornets trapped in a glass jar. The air doesn't just taste like damp, it tastes like wet copper and old, rotting secrets. My predecessor didn't leave a note of resignation or a manual. He left a single, laminated card sitting in the center of the desk, its edges curled and yellowed like a smoker's teeth. It was the only thing in the room that felt permanent. The supervisor who hired me was a man whose skin looked like cured leather stretched too tight over a skull. He didn't ask for a resume or references. He just looked at my hands to see if they shook, then handed me the keys. "Follow the rules," he had grunted, his voice sounding like gravel being ground in a mortar. "Don't get creative. Don't be a hero. Just exist until the sun comes up." He didn't tell me why the previous guard's locker was still full of his clothes, or why there was a deep, jagged gouge in the steel door of the control room that looked like it had been carved by a human fingernail. Rule 1 is the physical manifestation of my growing paranoia. At sunset, when the shadows of the pines stretch across the water like skeletal fingers, I have to lock the exterior doors. All of them. The heavy iron tumblers bite with a finality that sends a shiver down my spine. I walk the perimeter catwalks, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, revealing the way the mist clings to the railings like thick, wet spider webs. The locks are rusted, weeping orange streaks of oxidation that look like dried blood, and they scream when I turn the key, a high, metallic wail that echoes off the canyon walls. I check them twice. Then I check them again. Because out there, in the impenetrable black where the river meets the woods, I can hear the handles being rattled. It is not the wind. The wind does not possess the rhythmic, patient strength of something trying to find a gap in the armor, a weakness in the seal. Then comes the hour of the dead. From 1:13 a.m. to 3 a.m., the office ceases to be a place of work and becomes a sanctuary under siege. The desk phone, a heavy, beige plastic relic from a forgotten decade, sits under the blue light like a plastic tombstone. When the clock hits 1:13, the atmosphere in the room shifts. The static on the security monitors begins to curdle, the white noise coalescing into jagged, shivering shapes that dance on the edge of my peripheral vision. The phone begins to ring. It is not a normal sound. It is a violent, mechanical spasm that vibrates through the very floorboards, rattling the pens in their cup. The caller ID flashes with the words "Damn office." I am alone. There is no one else in the building. Yet the phone screams with a desperate, digital hunger. The rule says I must ignore it, but the sound is not just audio, it is a physical pressure. I can hear the electricity arcing inside the receiver, a crackling, wet sound, as if the person on the other end is trying to speak through a throat filled with river silt. I sit in my chair, my knuckles white as I grip the armrests, staring at that plastic skull until my eyes burn, listening to the rhythmic tolling of a bell for a funeral that hasn't happened yet. The third rule is the one that truly peels back the veil of reality. The whistling. It does not come from the woods or the wind. It comes from the reservoir, a sound that drifts over the lip of the spillway and through the thick, reinforced glass of the windows. It is a jagged, discordant melody, a series of notes that should not be able to exist in a sane world. It sounds like a flute carved from a human femur, played by someone who has forgotten what it means to breathe. It is a bird-like screech that carries a mocking, predatory intelligence. When the first note hits, I do not look out. I do not look at the black, glassy surface of the water where the starlight is swallowed whole. I turn my back. I face the cold, grey concrete of the interior wall. I press my forehead against the stone, the chill seeping into my skull, and I close my eyes until the darkness behind my lids is as thick as the mud at the bottom of the river. I stay there, a prisoner of my own fear, while the whistling circles the building, tapping on the glass, calling me to come out and play in the deep, cold dark. Sometimes, the whistling stops and the voices begin. This is the fourth rule, the one designed to protect the fragile glass of my sanity. The shadows in the corners of the control room, where the blue light fails to reach, begin to stir and lengthen. From the vents, from the cracks in the floorboards, from the very static of the monitors, I hear my name. Elias, it whispers. The voice is a perfect mimicry. It is my mother's voice, soft and comforting, the way it sounded before the cancer took her. It is the voice of an old friend I haven't spoken to in a decade. It is a wet, gurgling sound, as if the speaker's lungs are overflowing with silt and dead leaves. Elias, it is cold out here. Let us in. We found a way through the concrete. I have to bite my lip until I taste copper. I have to drown out the sound with the frantic pounding of my own heart. To acknowledge the voice is to give it a tether. To answer is to invite the void to take root in your chest. I remain a silent ghost in my own skin, listening to the things that used to be human plead for a warmth I can no longer provide. But the most terrifying thing in this dam is not the voices or the phone. It is Tunnel C. It is the yellow chain that hangs across the entrance like a rusted garland of warning. Beyond that chain, the air doesn't just feel cold, it feels ancient. It smells of tectonic shifts, of stagnant pools that haven't seen the sun in a million years, and the sharp, ozone tang of something forbidden. The chain is old, the gold paint flaking off like the scales of a dead serpent, but it feels like a holy barrier, the only thing keeping the world of light separate from the rotting dark. The light from my flashlight seems to be swallowed by the tunnel, the beam dying only a few feet past the threshold. It is a concrete gullet, a long, sloping descent into the foundations of the earth where the dam meets the bedrock. Every night, I walk to the edge. Every night, I see the boot prints. They are flat, heavy marks made by someone, or something, wearing old, waterlogged work boots. They emerge from the pitch black of Tunnel C and stop exactly 3 inches before the yellow chain. They wait there, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that I can feel in the roots of my teeth, a patient, rhythmic thud that matches the heartbeat of the dam itself. Something is down there, something that was trapped when they poured the concrete in 1964, something that has been waiting 40 years for a single, momentary lapse in the rules. The Susquehanna is a dark, churning beast, a liquid muscle flexed against the concrete ribs of Pennsylvania, and I am its silent jailer. I sit in the cold blue glow, watching the clock crawl toward the dawn. The turbines groan below me, the water presses against the walls with 1 billion tons of weight, and the rules are the only things keeping the walls from crumbling. The dam isn't just a structure, it's a seal. And every night, the seal gets a little thinner. Every night, the whistling gets a little louder. Every night, the boot prints get a little closer to the chain. The dread is a jagged piece of glass rotating in my gut, a constant reminder that I am not the master here. I am just the man who follows the rules, waiting for the night when the rules are no longer enough to keep the dark at bay. The concrete is breathing. I can feel it. A slow, tectonic expansion and contraction, as if the very heart of the state is trying to vomit up the evil we tried to bury in its veins. I check the locks again. I stare at the wall. I ignore the phone. I am a professional. I am a survivor. But in the cold blue light of the Kinzua Dam, even the strongest mind begins to fray like a rotted rope, and the static on the monitors is starting to sound like a choir of the drowned. The weight of the water is a physical presence. Imagine 1 billion tons of liquid blackness, a cold, unyielding force that never sleeps and never tires. That is what sits on the other side of the glass. It is a predator that has been fed a steady diet of towns, graveyards, and secrets. When the dam was built, they didn't just move the dirt, they moved the souls of the people who lived in the valley. Now, those souls are part of the silt, part of the pressure. The rules are not just safety guidelines, they are the terms of a treaty. A treaty signed in 1964 with a thing that has no name, a thing that was here before the river had a name, and a thing that will be here long after the concrete has returned to dust. I can feel it watching me, not with eyes, but with the cold, crushing weight of the reservoir. It is waiting for me to blink. It is waiting for me to pick up the phone. It is waiting for me to step over that yellow chain and join the silent, wet things that dance in the dark of Tunnel C. Until then, I follow the rules. I stay in the blue light. I face the wall. And I pray that the sun rises before the whistling finds a way inside. The fluorescent lights above my head don't just flicker. They scream in a frequency only the desperate can hear. They cast long, jagged shadows across the linoleum floor, turning the security office into a cage of strobe-lit geometry. It is 1:47 a.m. The air inside the dam smells of ozone, wet limestone, and the kind of ancient, stagnant cold that settles in your marrow and refuses to leave. I am standing exactly 3 inches from the north wall, my forehead pressed against the weeping concrete. This is the posture of a man surrendering to a God he doesn't believe in. Rule 3. If you hear the whistling, do not look at the monitors. Do not look at the windows. Face the wall and count the cracks in the cement until the air turns warm again. The whistling didn't start at the vents. It started out there, in the black moor of the Susquehanna, where the water churns into a white, violent froth before being swallowed by the intake grates. It began as a low, melodic thrum, something almost beautiful, like a flute played through a throat full of silt. But as the minutes ticked by, the melody curdled. Now, it is a high, piercing warble that slides under my fingernails and scrapes against the inside of my skull. It isn't a human sound. There is no breath behind it, no lungs to push the air. It is the sound of a void trying to imitate a memory. I can feel the vibration of it in the soles of my boots. The dam is a titan of iron and stone, a plug held in place by the grace of physics, but tonight it feels like a hollow ribcage. And something is knocking on the ribs. Behind me, on the desk I dare not turn to face, the telephone sits like a coiled viper. 113 came and went. I let it ring. I let the red light of the dam office caller ID bleed into the room, painting the walls in the color of an open wound. I didn't pick up. I followed the rules. But the whistling is different. The phone is an invitation. The whistling is an invasion. A drop of condensation slides down the wall and disappears into the collar of my shirt. I don't flinch. I can't. Through the thick, reinforced glass of the observation window behind me, I know the lake is watching. The water is a dark, heavy mirror, reflecting nothing but the predatory hunger of what lies beneath. I imagine the thing out there, Sawyer Crane or whatever wore his skin before the concrete claimed him in '64, standing on the surface of the black water, his feet not sinking, his mouth a jagged, vertical slit emitting that rhythmic, rot-scented tune. The lights overhead give a violent, dying pop. Darkness swallows the room for a heartbeat, and in that pulse of blackness, the whistling stops. The silence that follows is worse. It is heavy. It is a physical weight pressing against my shoulder blades, urging me to turn around, to just take a peek, to see if the world is still there. My heart is a frantic bird trapped in a box of meat. My pulse thumps in my ears, a rhythmic counterpoint to the distant, subterranean groan of the turbines. Then, I hear it. The sound of something wet. Slap. Drag. Slap. Drag. It's coming from the hallway. Not the lake. The whistling didn't stay outside. It followed the scent of my fear through the ventilation shafts, through the cracks in the masonry, or perhaps it simply manifested from the damp shadows of Tunnel C. The sound is rhythmic, the heavy footfall of a sodden boot filled with river mud. I close my eyes so tight I see static, white, jagged lines dancing in the dark of my eyelids. I press my palms into the concrete until the rough grit draws blood. I know you're in there, Elias. The voice isn't a voice. It's the whistling, shaped into the jagged architecture of my name. It sounds like wet leather tearing. It sounds like the gurgle of a drowning man's last breath. I don't respond. Rule 3 is absolute. If you speak, you give it a bridge. If you look, you give it a door. I stay a statue, a part of the architecture, a sacrificial lamb waiting for the sun to burn the shadows away. The smell hits me then. It's the smell of the river bottom, decaying vegetation, rusted iron, and the sickly sweet stench of something that has been dead for decades but forgot how to stay still. It's right behind me. I can feel the sudden drop in temperature, a pocket of Arctic air that smells of the abyss. The flickering light returns, more frantic now, a strobe light of neon blue and sickly yellow. In the brief flashes of light, I see my own shadow on the wall in front of me. And then, I see another shadow. It is tall. Too tall. Its limbs are elongated, bending at angles that defy the limitations of bone. It is standing directly behind me, its head tilted, peering over my shoulder. In the reflection of a small, polished brass pipe on the wall, I catch a distorted glimpse of a hand reaching out. The fingers are long, pale as fish bellies, and tipped with nails that look like shards of obsidian. They are dripping. Thick, black river water peters onto the floor, the sound of each drop hitting the linoleum like a hammer blow in the oppressive quiet. The whistling starts again, but this time, it's a whisper, inches from my ear. It's a lullaby from the basement of the world. It tells me about the pressure. It tells me how it feels to have tons of water pressing down on your chest until your ribs snap like dry tinder. It tells me about the cold, the beautiful, silent dark of Tunnel C, where the concrete is soft and the voices never stop. Just a look, the whistle voice rasps. Just a turn of the head, Elias. See what we've built for you. See the crack in the wall. It's growing. It's breathing. It wants you to fill the gap. My legs are shaking. The paranoia is no longer a mental state. It is a physical toxin coursing through my veins. Every instinct I have, honed by millions of years of evolution, is screaming at me to run, to fight, to scream back. But the rules are the only thing keeping the blood inside my body. The rules are the only thin line between me and the silent, wet things that dance in the dark. The entity leans closer. I can feel a cold, damp breath on the nape of my neck. It smells like the silt of the Pennsylvania wilderness. I focus on a single crack in the concrete, a jagged line that looks like a lightning bolt. I trace it with my eyes over and over. I count the grains of sand in the cement. I become the wall. I am stone. I am unmoving. I am part of the dam. A sudden, violent crash echoes from the far end of the hallway. The sound of metal being twisted, of the yellow chain being snapped like a piece of twine. The thing behind me lets out a frustrated, guttural hiss, a sound of escaping steam. The whistling reaches a deafening, discordant peak, a sonic assault that makes my ears bleed, and then, as quickly as it began, it recedes. The wet footsteps retreat. Slap, drag, slap, drag. They head toward the darkness of the corridor, toward the forbidden maw of Tunnel C. The temperature in the room begins to rise. The smell of the river fades, replaced by the biting scent of dry dust and old grease. I stay against the wall. I don't move for an hour. I don't move when the phone rings again at 3 a.m. I don't move when the turbines skip a beat, sending a shudder through the entire structure. I wait until the first grey, pathetic light of a Pennsylvania dawn filters through the high, grime-streaked windows. Only then do I pull my face away from the wall. My skin is bruised, imprinted with the texture of the concrete. I turn around slowly, my muscles screaming in protest. The office is empty. The monitors are humming with static. But on the floor, right where the thing had been standing, is a puddle of black, brackish water. And in the center of that puddle, a single, waterlogged human tooth. I look at the yellow chain at the end of the hall. It hangs limp, one end torn from the masonry. Beyond it, the darkness of Tunnel C seems to pulse, a slow, rhythmic expansion like a lung made of shadow. The wall down there is bulging. The concrete is no longer a solid, it's a skin, and whatever is behind it is pushing, testing the strength of the seal, waiting for the next night, the next rule to be broken, the next man to turn his head. I pick up the plastic card with the 5 rules. My hands are shaking so hard I almost drop it. I realize now that the rules aren't there to save me. They are there to keep the dam from breaking. They are there to keep the hunger contained. And as I look at the tooth on the floor, I realize the most terrifying truth of all. The dam isn't holding back the water. It's holding back the scream of a god that drowned before the first mountain was formed. I have to stay. I have to follow the rules. Because if I don't, the whistling won't just be a sound. It will be the only thing left of the world. The rain isn't falling in Pennsylvania tonight. It is collapsing. It hammers against the reinforced glass of the observation deck with the rhythmic violence of 1,000 fists trying to find a soft spot in the skull of the world. Outside, the Susquehanna is a churning, bloated corpse of a river, white-capped and screaming as it hurls itself against the concrete face of the dam. But the sound outside is nothing compared to the silence inside. It's a heavy, pressurized silence that tastes like copper and old blood. I am sitting in the dark, my fingers white-knuckled around the edges of the plastic laminated rule sheet. Rule number 2 is staring back at me, its black ink appearing to writhe like drowning worms under the dim flickers of my dying flashlight. Do not answer the desk phone between 1:13 a.m. and 3 a.m. I've lived by that rule for 3 months. I've sat through the ringing. I've endured the way the air turns cold enough to frost my breath whenever that mechanical trill starts. But tonight is different. Tonight, the dam is breathing. It started when the main grid went dark. A bolt of lightning, jagged and violet, tore through the sky and struck the transformer housing on the ridge. The humming, that constant, comforting vibration of the turbines that usually reassures me that the man-made world is still winning, just stopped. The transition from mechanical drone to absolute void was instantaneous. Then, the emergency lights kicked in. Not the warm, yellow glow of the backups, but the jagged, rhythmic pulse of the red strobes. Blood light. Every 3 seconds, the world flashes into a gore-slicked reality, revealing the peeling grey paint of the walls, and then plunges back into a blackness so thick I can feel it sliding into my lungs. And then, exactly at 1:13 a.m., the phone began to scream. It wasn't just a ring. It was a jagged spike of sound that bypassed my ears and pierced directly into my brainstem. It sounded like static fed through a meat grinder. I stared at the console. The small LCD screen, powered by some internal, dying battery, flickered with a single line of text, "Damn office." But I am the damn office. There is no one else here. There is no one else for 10 miles. The red strobe flashed. The phone rattled on the desk, vibrating with such intensity that it began to dance toward the edge. Flash. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to detach themselves from the floor, stretching toward the sound. Flash. The ringing grew louder, a cacophony of distorted voices layered under the electronic pulse, 1,000 drowned souls trying to speak through a single copper wire. My sanity began to fray at the edges, snapping like dry rot. The rules said don't answer. They didn't say I had to listen to it. The panic was a cold, oily slick in my gut. I thought I was being smart. I thought I could find a loophole in the nightmare. I reached out, my hand trembling in the strobe light, looking like a severed limb moving in stop motion. I didn't pick up the receiver. I didn't answer the call. I grabbed the cord. I wrapped the black, coiled wire around my fist and I pulled. The plastic snap of the jackbreaking felt like a bone snapping in my own body. The silence that followed was worse than the ringing. It was a vacuum. A total, suffocating absence of sound that made my ears ache as if the atmospheric pressure had suddenly tripled. I stood there, the broken cord dangling from my hand like a dead umbilical cord, and for a second, I felt a surge of triumph. I had won. I had silenced the warning. Then the smell hit me. It wasn't the smell of the river. It was the smell of the deep earth, the scent of things that have never seen the sun, of rotting silt, of ancient, stagnant water trapped in pockets of stone for 1 billion years. It was the smell of a tomb that had just been cracked open. A low, wet sound echoed from the hallway. A slap, a squelch, the sound of a heavy, sodden weight being dragged across the linoleum. My heart didn't just beat, it slammed against my ribs like a trapped animal. The red strobe flashed. The hallway was empty. Flash. Something was there. A dark smear on the floor, glistening like oil. Flash. It was closer. I backed away, my heels clicking against the floor, until I hit the far wall. I remembered Rule 3. If you hear whistling, face the wall. But there was no whistling yet. There was only the sound of the world breaking. The floor beneath my feet began to vibrate, not with the hum of the turbines, but with a low-frequency thrum that made my teeth ache. It was coming from below, from Tunnel C. The red strobe light revealed the yellow chain draped across the entrance to the lower levels. It was swaying. Something was pushing against the air from the other side. I realized then, with a soul-crushing clarity, what I had done. The phone wasn't a call. It was a tether. The electrical current running through that line was part of a circuit, a sequence of minor, mundane actions that kept the reality of this place anchored. By unplugging the warning, I hadn't stopped the call. I had cut the leash. The air began to shimmer with static. My skin crawled as if thousands of invisible insects were migrating across my flesh. From the darkness of Tunnel C, a sound finally emerged. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the storm. It was a whistle. A high, melodic, and impossibly thin sound that drifted up the stairwell like a thread of smoke. It was beautiful. It was the most terrifying thing I have ever heard. It was the sound of a lung filled with silt trying to mimic a bird. I turned. I slammed my forehead against the cold, damp concrete of the wall, closing my eyes until I saw stars. I pressed my palms flat against the rough surface, the grit biting into my skin. Face the wall. Do not look. Do not look. Do not look. But the wall was moving. Underneath my hands, the 2-foot-thick reinforced concrete was softening. It felt like pressing my hands into a giant, cold slab of liver. It was pulsing. A slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction. The dam was no longer a structure of engineering. It was a throat, and I was standing in the middle of it. I heard the wet footsteps stop directly behind me. The smell of the void was so thick now I could taste it on my tongue, a flavor of wet ash and old pennies. I felt a coldness radiating off whatever was standing there, a chill that seemed to suck the very heat out of my blood. The whistling stopped. A voice, or something trying very hard to sound like one, whispered my name. It didn't come from the air. It came from the wall. The words vibrated through the concrete and into my skull. Sawyer. Crane. Found. A. Way. Out. The name from the files. The man who was swallowed by the paw in '64. I squeezed my eyes shut tighter, hot tears leaking out and soaking into the concrete. The rules. I had to follow the rules. But the rules were designed for a world where the light stayed on. In the red strobe light, the rules were just a suicide note written in installments. A heavy, damp weight pressed against my back. It felt like a bag of wet sand, cold and unresponsive. I felt the sensation of long, multi-jointed fingers brushing against the nape of my neck. The skin there broke into violent shivers. Every instinct I had, every billion-year-old evolutionary drive, screamed at me to run, to bolt into the dark, to jump into the churning river rather than spend another second in the presence of that thing. But Rule 4. Never cross the yellow chain into Tunnel C. I realized the entity wasn't trying to kill me. Not yet. It was pushing me. It was maneuvering me toward the stairwell. It wanted me to flee. It wanted me to break the final seal. It had spent 40 years trying to coax, bribe, and terrify the watchers into opening the way. It had manipulated the phone calls. It had perfected the whistling. And I, in my blind panic, had already given it the first key by cutting the line. The concrete wall against my face suddenly buckled inward. A crack formed, and I heard the unmistakable sound of pressurized water hissing through a fissure. But it wasn't water. It was a black, tar-like substance that began to ooze over my fingers. It was the blood of the dam. I pulled away from the wall, forgetting the rule, forgetting everything but the need to survive. The red strobe flashed. In that split second of light, I saw it. It wasn't a man. It was a composite of things that shouldn't exist together. It was a tall, elongated shape wrapped in a tattered yellow slicker that seemed to be fused to its grey, translucent skin. Where a face should have been, there was only a series of concentric circles of needle-like teeth, swirling in a slow, hypnotic spiral. Its arms were too long, ending in hands that had too many knuckles, reaching out to cradle my head. I didn't scream. My throat had turned to stone. I lunged to the side, stumbling through the dark, the red strobe light mocking my every movement. I didn't head for the exit. I knew the exit was gone. The door I had locked per Rule 1 was no longer a door. It was just more of that living, breathing stone. There was only one way left to go. The yellow chain. I dove toward it, my boots slipping on the black while coating the floor. I felt the entity's fingers graze my jacket, a touch so cold it felt like a burn. I scrambled over the chain, the metal links cold and heavy against my thighs. The moment I crossed that threshold into the mouth of Tunnel C, the whistling stopped. The red strobe stopped. Total, absolute darkness. I lay there on the cold floor, gasping for air that felt like liquid lead. I listened. From the other side of the chain, I heard the sound of the entity scratching at the air. It couldn't cross. The chain wasn't a warning for me. It was a boundary for it. But I was now on the wrong side of the cage. I felt around in the dark until my hand hit something cold and metallic. A heavy-duty industrial sprayer. The construction foam. My mind, fractured and reeling, latched onto the final stage of the nightmare. The wall at the end of Tunnel C wasn't just a wall. It was the cork in a bottle. And I could hear the glass cracking. I stood up, my legs shaking so violently I could barely stay upright. I began to shuffle deeper into the tunnel, my hands trailing along the walls. The concrete here was hot. It was vibrating with a primal, rhythmic force that felt like a heartbeat. The deeper I went, the louder the sound became. Not a whistle, but a low, guttural groan that seemed to rise from the very foundations of the Appalachian Mountains. The dam isn't holding back the Susquehanna. It's a muzzle. I reached the end of the tunnel. The air here was thick with the smell of ozone and rotting fish. I fumbled for my flashlight, clicking it on. The beam was weak, a sickly yellow circle that barely cut through the gloom. The wall was bulging. A massive, circular section of the concrete was protruding outward, the surface crisscrossed with jagged, glowing cracks. Through the fissures, I could see a void that wasn't just black, it was an absence of reality. It was a hole in the universe. And from that hole, a single, pale eye, the size of a man's torso, was watching me. It wasn't an eye of an animal. It was the eye of something that had watched the stars be born and had found them lacking. The whistling started again, but this time it was coming from inside my own head. Fix it. The voice vibrated through my marrow. I realized then that Sawyer Crane hadn't been a victim. He had been the last one to try and plug the leak. He was still here, his biomass incorporated into the patch, his soul used as a sealant. I looked at the industrial foam sprayer in my hand. I looked at the widening cracks, the black void behind the concrete beginning to spill out like a slow-motion explosion of shadow. If I didn't seal it, the dam would fail. Not because of the water pressure, but because the thing behind the wall would finally finish its scream. And if it screamed, Pennsylvania would be the first thing to vanish, followed by the rest of a world that was never meant to know what lies beneath the stone. I stepped forward, the foam sprayer heavy in my arms. I reached out toward the pulsing, warm concrete. The red strobe from the hallway somehow bled into the tunnel, a faint, rhythmic pulse of bloodlight. I am the guard. I follow the rules. And the rules are simple. The scream must stay inside the mountain. I pulled the trigger, and the white, chemical foam began to hiss into the cracks, a desperate bandage on a god's wound. I felt the heat rising, the concrete beginning to soften around my boots, pulling me in. I didn't struggle. I just kept spraying. Because if I don't stay, if I don't become part of the wall, the whistling won't just be a sound. It will be the only thing left of the world. The foam hissed like a dying lung, a pathetic white smear against the obsidian rod of the concrete. I could feel the heat radiating from the breach, a feverish, unnatural warmth that smelled of wet copper and stagnant silt. This wasn't just a structural failure. The wall was breathing. Every time I pressed the nozzle of the canister, the surface beneath my boots undulated, a slow, rhythmic throb that sent tremors up through my shins and into the marrow of my bones. The dirty yellow light of the overhead sodium lamps flickered, casting long, industrial shadows that seemed to detach themselves from the floor and crawl toward the corners of my vision. In this place, the light didn't illuminate. It only stained the world in the color of old bruises and jaundice. The foam began to bubble, reacting to whatever was pushing from the other side. It didn't set. It melted. It turned into a gray, viscous sludge that dripped down the face of the wall like tears of liquid lead. I realized then that the rules were never meant to save me. They were a recipe for a ritual I had been performing without knowing the ingredients. Lock the doors. Don't answer the phone. Close your eyes. They weren't safety precautions. They were ways to minimize the interference of the living world while the dead one tried to swallow the damn whole. I saw him then, or rather, I saw the memory of him etched into the very grain of the stone. 1964. The record said Sawyer Crane fell into the pour. A tragic industrial accident. A man lost to the foundation. But as the wall softened, turning into something that felt more like wet muscle than cured aggregate, I saw the truth. Sawyer didn't fall. He was placed. He was the mortar. He was the first layer of the seal, his screams muffled by tons of wet grey slurry until he became the very thing he was meant to contain. The concrete wasn't just holding back the Susquehanna River. It was a cage for something that had been whispering in the dark of this valley since the mountains were nothing but jagged teeth. The whistling began again. It wasn't coming from the lake or the hallway anymore. It was coming from inside the wall, inches from my face. It was a sound stripped of all humanity, a high-pitched, oscillating vibration that felt like a needle being driven into my ear canal. It carried the texture of static, white noise from a dead television, crackling with a malevolence that defied logic. I dropped the empty canister, my fingers numb and useless. The wall before me wasn't a wall anymore. It was a lid, and it was popping. A jagged fissure snaked upward from the floor, a black void opening in the center of the concrete. It wasn't empty. It was filled with a thick, oily darkness that seemed to drink the meager yellow light of the tunnel. I saw a hand, if you could call it that, press against the edge of the crack. It was long, the fingers articulated with too many joints, the skin the color of a drowned man's belly, translucent and slick with the slime of the deep earth. It didn't claw. It reached with a slow, agonizing patience. It was the hand of Sawyer Crane, or what was left of him after 40 years of being digested by the entity that lived in the void. I backed away, but the floor had turned to a consistency of thick mud. My boots sank. The industrial shadows coiled around my ankles like oily ropes, pinning me to the spot. The heat was unbearable now, a dry, desert heat that tasted of dust and ancient, forgotten graves. I looked at the yellow chain I had stepped over, the boundary I was never supposed to cross. It lay on the ground, glowing with a sickly, phosphorescent light, mocking my curiosity. The whistling shifted. It began to form words, or the approximation of words, filtered through a throat filled with silt. Open the gate. It groaned, a sound that vibrated in my chest, threatening to stop my heart. The crack in the wall widened with a sound like a gunshot. A chunk of concrete the size of a tombstone fell away, shattering on the floor. Behind it, there was no rebar, no gravel, no structural steel. There was only a pulsing, obsidian cavity that looked like the interior of a giant lung. I reached for the second canister of foam, my movements sluggish as if I were underwater. My mind was fracturing, the noir shadows of the tunnel bleeding into the static of the whistling until the world was nothing but a grainy, black and white nightmare. I saw the faces of the guards who had come before me, the ones who had resigned or vanished. Their silhouettes were burned into the walls of Tunnel C, a gallery of the damned, their eyes hollowed out by the same truth I was now staring into. We weren't employees. We were maintenance. We were the skin grafts for a god that refused to heal. I began to spray again, but this time, I didn't aim for the crack. I aimed for the hand. The foam coated the pale, multi-jointed fingers, hardening instantly as if the entity's own coldness was catalyzing the reaction. The thing behind the wall shrieked, a sound of grinding metal and breaking glass. The wall buckled toward me, the concrete surface rippling like a disturbed pond. I felt the spray on my own skin, the foam burning like acid, binding my flesh to the industrial stone. The lights flickered one last time and then died, leaving me in the absolute, crushing darkness of the void. But I could still see. I could see through the static. The walls were glowing with a faint, necrotic light. I saw the entity clearly now, a mass of shifting, impossible geometry, a creature made of shadows and old, wet hunger. It was trying to fold itself through the crack, to pull its massive, ancient bulk into the narrow confines of the tunnel. I didn't run. There was nowhere to run. The dam was a closed loop, a concrete trap designed to keep the world out and the horror in. If I left, the seal would fail. The whistling would become a scream that would shatter the windows of every house in the county. The river wouldn't just flood, it would become a conduit for the things that lived in the silt, the things that had been waiting for the concrete to rot. I pressed my body against the wall, using my own weight to hold the foam in place as it hardened. The heat from the entity scorched my chest, the smell of my own singed clothes mixing with the scent of the deep earth. I felt the concrete beginning to soften around me, not like mud, but like a mouth. It was inviting me in. It wanted a new Sawyer Crane. It wanted a new soul to dampen the vibrations of the entity's rage. The rules. I remembered the final rule, the one written in a different handwriting on the back of the card. If the wall speaks, give it what it wants. I closed my eyes and stopped fighting the pull of the stone. The static in the air intensified, the whistling turning into a low, melodic hum that vibrated through my skull. I could feel the microscopic grains of sand and cement entering my pores, the wall becoming my skin, my bones becoming the rebar. The dirty yellow light of my flashlight, lying forgotten on the floor, cast a final, fading beam on the yellow chain. I wasn't a man anymore. I was a repair. I was the bandage on a god's wound. The concrete was cool now, the fever breaking as it absorbed my warmth. The silence that followed was heavier than the stone itself. The whistling had stopped, replaced by the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the dam, a heartbeat that now matched my own. Somewhere in the distance, a telephone began to ring. 1:13 a.m. But I wouldn't answer it. I couldn't. I was part of the structure now, a silent sentinel in the dark. The void was sealed, at least for another 40 years, and the only thing left of the man who had walked into Tunnel C was a faint, human-shaped ripple in the concrete, a shadow that never moved, even when the lights came back on. The dam held. The river stayed in its bed. And in the deep, industrial silence of the night, the only sound was the slow, steady drip of water against a wall that had finally learned how to breathe. The breathing was a wet, rhythmic grinding of stone against stone, a sound that bypassed my ears and vibrated directly into the marrow of my shins. I stood in the center of Tunnel C, the harsh, unforgiving beam of my industrial spotlight fixed on the section of the wall where the shadow of Sawyer Crane had finally stopped moving. The concrete here didn't look like the sturdy, grey heart of a Pennsylvania landmark anymore. It looked like bruised meat. It looked like a lung made of aggregate and rusted rebar, expanding and contracting with a slow, agonizing effort that made the very air in the tunnel feel thin and used. I could smell it now. It wasn't just the dampness of the Susquehanna or the metallic tang of the turbines upstairs. It was a thick, cloying stench of stagnant silt and old, forgotten things left to rot in a place where the sun never reached. It was the smell of 1964, of a man buried alive in a tomb of wet cement, and of the thing that had been waiting there for him long before the first shovel hit the dirt. The first crack appeared at 3:03 a.m. It didn't snap. It groaned. A jagged, black lightning bolt tore across the surface of the breathing wall, and from that thin, dark line, a substance began to weep. It wasn't water. It was a thick, viscous sludge that looked like liquefied shadow, bubbling and hissing as it touched the cold floor of the tunnel. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs, slamming against my chest with a violence that made my vision blur. I remembered the rules. I remembered the plastic-wrapped card in my pocket that I had treated like a joke just 3 hours ago. Rule 5. Never cross the golden chain. I had crossed it. I was standing in the throat of the beast, and the beast was waking up. The spotlight flickered, the battery struggling against the oppressive static that seemed to radiate from the wall. In the strobe-like flashes of light, I saw it. A hand. Not a human hand, but a suggestion of one, formed from the shifting, wet concrete. It pressed from the inside out, the wall bowing toward me like a sheet of grey rubber. I could see the outline of long, spindly fingers, the knuckles cracking with the sound of breaking slate. It was pushing. It was trying to step through the very foundation of the dam. I grabbed the industrial foam gun from my belt, my fingers slick with a cold sweat that felt like grease. The instructions on the side of the canister were for sealing leaks in the cooling pipes, but this wasn't a leak. This was an invasion. I stepped forward, my boots splashing through the black sludge that was now pooling around my ankles. The cold of it was absolute, a freezing, numbing bite that felt like it was trying to pull the heat out of my soul. I shoved the nozzle of the foam gun into the widening crack. The black void inside seemed to pull at the metal tube, a gravity that shouldn't exist. I pulled the trigger. The foam hissed out, a violent, chemical white against the rotting grey, expanding rapidly to fill the breach. But as soon as it touched the darkness inside, the foam didn't harden. It shriveled. It turned black and brittle, falling away in charred flakes as if it had been sprayed into a furnace. The whistling started again. It didn't come from the lake this time. It came from behind the wall. A low, melodic tune that sounded like a lullaby played on a broken flute. It was the same tune the old-timers at the local diner warned me about, the one they said Sawyer Crane used to whistle while he worked the graveyard shift. Except now, it was layered with 1,000 other voices, a chorus of the drowned, humming in a frequency that made my teeth ache and my nose begin to bleed. I fell back, the spotlight slipping from my hand and rolling across the floor. The beam hit the wall at an angle, casting long, distorted shadows that looked like a crowd of people standing just behind the concrete, their faces pressed against the surface, their mouths open in silent, screaming voids. The wall was no longer just breathing, it was undulating. The entire corridor of Tunnel C was beginning to warp, the straight industrial lines bending into organic, serpentine curves. I scrambled for the spotlight, my hands plunging into the black muck. My fingers brushed against something hard and cold beneath the surface of the sludge. I pulled it up. It was a boot. An old, rubber work boot from the 60s, filled with grey, calcified bone and bits of rotted denim. I dropped it, a strangled cry dying in my throat. The wall let out a wet, tearing sound. A hole opened up, the size of a man's head, and through that hole, I saw the eye. It was huge, pale, and filmed over with a milky cataract, staring out from the darkness with a prehistoric hunger. It didn't look at me. It looked through me, seeing the river outside, seeing the town of people sleeping peacefully in the valley below, unaware that the only thing standing between them and a flood of ancient malice was a terrified man with a failing flashlight. The pressure in the tunnel surged. I could hear the sirens now, the deep, mournful wail of the dam's emergency system, but they sounded miles away, muffled by the static that was now screaming in my brain. I knew what I had to do. I didn't have the foam. I didn't have the tools. I only had the rules I had broken. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaking so hard I could barely keep my balance. I walked toward the wall, toward that pale, unblinking eye. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the golden chain I had unhooked to enter the tunnel. It was just a piece of cheap, painted metal, but as I held it, it felt heavy. It felt like an anchor. I didn't try to seal the crack with chemicals. I took the chain and began to wrap it around the protruding rebar that jutted from the crumbling concrete like broken ribs. As the metal touched the wall, the whistling turned into a shriek. The concrete lashed out, a spray of grey grit hitting my face, stinging my eyes, but I didn't stop. I looped the chain over and over, weaving a web of gold across the black fissure. The eye behind the wall rolled frantically, the pale iris shrinking as the chain tightened. The breathing became jagged, a desperate gasping for air that wasn't there. I felt a cold, wet hand brush against my shoulder, a phantom touch that smelled of the riverbed, but I refused to look back. I remembered the rule. If you hear the whistling, face the wall. I pressed my forehead against the cold, vibrating stone. I closed my eyes and whispered the words I had found scrawled on the back of the rule card, the words I thought were a prank. The river stays in its bed. The stone stays in its place. The debt is paid in silence. The vibration reached a crescendo, a bone-rattling roar that felt like the dam was finally collapsing. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, industrial silence that felt like a weight on my eardrums. I opened my eyes. The spotlight was still on the floor, its beam steady now. The wall was solid. The cracks were gone, replaced by smooth, seamless concrete that looked as if it had been poured yesterday. The black sludge had vanished, leaving only a faint, damp stain on the floor. The golden chain was gone too. Not fallen, but gone, as if it had been absorbed into the structure itself. I stood there for a long time, listening to the slow, steady drip of water from a nearby pipe. My heart slowly returned to a normal rhythm, though the cold in my bones remained. I picked up my light and began the long walk back to the surface. I didn't look back at Tunnel C. I didn't need to. I knew that the shadow was still there, a permanent, human-shaped ripple in the concrete that would never move again, at least not until the next person forgot the rules. When I reached the guard office, the phone was ringing. It was 3:15 a.m. I didn't answer it. I sat down in the creaking chair, pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, and began to write. I wrote about the smell of the silt. I wrote about the eye in the darkness. I wrote about how the dam doesn't just hold back the water, it holds back the things that live underneath the water, the things that were here before the towns, before the state, before the world forgot how to be afraid of the dark. I looked at the monitor. The cameras showed the surface of the lake, still and black under the moon. Somewhere deep in the guts of the masonry, the dam groaned, a low, settling sound that most people would take for granted. But I knew better. It wasn't the sound of settling stone. It was a sigh, a long, satisfied breath from a wall that had finally learned how to be a grave again. I stayed in that chair until the sun began to bleed over the horizon, turning the Pennsylvania sky a bruised purple. I didn't quit. I couldn't quit, because now I knew the most important rule of all, the one they didn't put on the card. The dam needs a witness, and the witness belongs to the dam. The morning shift arrived like clockwork, but they didn't look at me. Not really. They moved like ghosts in high visibility vests, their eyes averted, their mouths tight lines of practiced indifference. I realized then that I wasn't just a night watchman. I was a component, a gear in a machine designed to keep a secret buried under millions of tons of water and concrete. I went home, but the silence of my apartment felt wrong. It lacked the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of the turbines. It lacked the weight of the Susquehanna River pressing against my spine. I tried to sleep, but when I closed my eyes, I saw the yellow chain. I saw the door to Tunnel C. Most of all, I heard that whistling, a thin, melodic trill that sounded like wind through a ribcage. The following night, the humidity in the Pennsylvania hills turned into something suffocating. A storm was rolling in from the west, a bruised mass of clouds that swallowed the stars. When I clocked in, the air inside the dam felt thick, like I was inhaling wet wool. The supervisor, a man named Miller who looked like he'd been carved out of driftwood, handed me the flashlight and didn't say a word. He just tapped the plastic-coated rule card on the desk. His fingernail was yellowed and cracked. He looked at me for a split second, and I saw a flicker of pity in his eyes. Or maybe it was just the reflection of the dying fluorescent lights overhead. By midnight, the storm hit. It wasn't just rain. It was a deluge that turned the world outside into a grey void. The dam groaned. It was a sound I'd grown used to, but tonight the groans felt like words. Deep, guttural syllables vibrating through the soles of my boots. I sat in the booth, the rules sitting on the desk like a death warrant. Rule 2. Absolute silence on the landline from 1:13 to 3 a.m. At exactly 1:13 a.m., the phone began to ring. The sound was jagged, cutting through the white noise of the storm. I stared at the caller ID. Office. There was no one in the office. I was the only soul in this wing of the facility. I remembered the rules. I kept my hands in my lap, gripping my knees until my knuckles turned white. But the ringing didn't stop. It wasn't the rhythmic pulse of a normal phone. It was erratic, aggressive. It sounded like someone screaming in short, sharp bursts. 5 minutes passed. 10. The sound was drilling into my skull, a spike of high-pitched static. Then came the whistling. It started low, drifting from the ventilation ducts. It was the same tune from the night before, but closer now. It had a wet, bubbly quality to it, as if the whistler's lungs were filled with river silt. I followed Rule 3. I stood up and pressed my forehead against the cold, damp concrete of the back wall. I shut my eyes so tight I saw bursts of red. Face the wall. Do not look at the monitors. Do not look at the shadows. The whistling grew louder, circling the room. I heard the sound of wet footsteps. Squelch. Drag. Squelch. Drag. It was the sound of heavy boots filled with water. The air in the room suddenly turned freezing, and the smell hit me. It was the stench of an open grave at the bottom of a lake. Rotting vegetation, dead fish, and something metallic, like old blood. The footsteps stopped right behind me. I could feel the cold radiating off whatever was standing there. My neck hairs stood up. A raspy, bubbling breath tickled my ear. It didn't whisper name. It just whistled. One long, rising note that felt like a needle sliding into my brain. In a moment of pure, unadulterated panic, I broke. The pressure in my chest snapped. I didn't look back, but I lunged for the phone. I didn't answer it. I did something worse. I grabbed the cord and yanked it out of the wall. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. The whistling stopped instantly. The footsteps were gone, but the air stayed cold. The smell of the river deepened, becoming a physical weight in the room. I turned around, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The room was empty, but on the floor, leading from the hallway to the desk, were a series of wet, muddy footprints. They were large, misshapen, and they didn't lead back out. They stopped at the edge of the desk. And then, I saw the monitors. The camera for the hallway leading to Tunnel C was flickering with heavy static. But through the snow, I saw it. The golden chain was swinging violently, as if something had just charged through it. The heavy iron door at the end of the hall, the one that was supposed to be bolted from the outside, was standing ajar. A sliver of absolute darkness spilled out from the opening. Then the power failed. The backup generators hummed, but the lights didn't come on. Instead, a series of red emergency strobes began to pulse. Blood red light. Absolute black. Blood red light. Absolute black. In the darkness, the dam felt like it was breathing. I grabbed my flashlight, but the beam was weak, a sickly yellow light that barely cut through the gloom. I knew I had to go down there. The rules were the only things keeping the lid on this place, and I had shattered them. I had pulled the plug. I had let the static in. I walked toward Tunnel C, my boots clicking on the metal grates. The red strobe light made everything look like it was moving in stop motion. One flash, the hallway was empty. Next flash, a shadow seemed to be looming closer. Next flash, it was gone. The smell of rot was so thick now I had to pull my shirt over my nose to keep from gagging. I reached the golden chain. It lay on the floor. The links snapped like they were made of plastic. I stepped over it, and the moment I did, the temperature dropped another 20 degrees. My breath misted in the air. The entrance to Tunnel C wasn't just a hallway. It was a throat. The walls were narrower here, the concrete damp and covered in a fine, black mold that looked like hair. I pushed the heavy iron door open. It creaked with the sound of 1,000 dying screams. My flashlight beam hit the walls, and I gasped. The concrete was moving. It wasn't a structural failure. It was organic. The walls were pulsating, bulging outward in slow, rhythmic throbs. In the center of the tunnel, where the concrete had been poured in 1964, there was a massive fissure. It looked like a jagged mouth torn into the side of the world. From within that fissure, a black, viscous fluid was weeping, pooling on the floor. I remembered the story of Sawyer Crane. They said he was buried in the pour. But looking at this, I realized the truth was much worse. They hadn't buried him to get rid of him. They had used him as a seal. His body, his soul, fused with the lime and the rebar to hold back something that lived in the earth long before the dam was a blueprint. And now, because I had disconnected the line, because I had failed to be the silent witness, the seal was breaking. I saw a hand. It pushed out from the fissure. It was a human hand, but the skin was the color of a drowned corpse, gray and translucent. The fingers were impossibly long, the nails jagged and black. It gripped the edge of the concrete, and I heard the sound of stone cracking. Another hand followed. Then a head began to emerge. It had no hair, no eyes, just a smooth, wet surface where a face should be, with a single, vertical slit that whistled as it drew air. This was the entity. This was the thing that had been wearing Sawyer Crane's memory like a tattered coat. It wasn't just a ghost. It was a void. A piece of the primordial dark that had been trapped under the weight of the river, and it was hungry. I remembered the last rule, the one Miller had pointed to with his broken nail. If the breach begins, the witness must seal the abyss. I looked at the floor near the entrance. There were several cans of high-expansion industrial foam and a heavy-duty caulking gun filled with a strange, silver-fleck compound. This wasn't standard construction material. It smelled of ozone and sulfur. The thing in the wall was halfway out now. Its torso was a mass of fused bone and wet concrete, its movements jerky and unnatural. It let out a sound, not a whistle this time, but a low, vibrating hum that made my teeth ache. It started to pull itself toward me, dragging its heavy, unfinished lower half through the fissure. I scrambled for the canisters. My flashlight flickered, the beam dying. I shook it frantically, the light returning just as the entity reached out a long, wet arm toward my ankle. I kicked at it, my boot sinking into the soft, rotting grey flesh. It felt like kicking a bag of wet mud. I grabbed the foam canister and aimed it at the fissure. I squeezed the trigger, and a thick, grey spray exploded outward. The moment it hit the entity, the thing shrieked. The sound wasn't auditory. It was a psychic blast that sent me reeling against the opposite wall. The foam didn't just expand, it hardened instantly, turning into a crystalline structure that glowed with a faint, sickly blue light. The entity lashed out, its long fingers raking across my chest, tearing through my uniform and leaving lines of burning cold on my skin. I screamed, but I didn't stop. I jammed the nozzle of the caulking gun into the center of the fissure, right into the dark void behind the entity's head. I emptied the entire tube. The silver compound acted like a catalyst. The moving concrete began to thrash. The walls of the tunnel groaned and buckled as the substance fought the darkness. The entity began to be pulled back in, the void behind the wall acting like a vacuum. It clawed at the air, its faceless head turning toward me. For a second, the slit opened, and I heard a voice. It wasn't Sawyer Crane's. It was 1,000 voices, all speaking at once, a cacophony of the drowned and the forgotten. Let us in. I didn't answer. I grabbed the final canister of foam and emptied it until the fissure was nothing but a bulging, glowing scar of hardened resin. I backed away, falling over the snapped golden chain, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The pulsing stopped. The whistling died. The temperature began to rise, the freezing chill replaced by the humid, heavy air of the Pennsylvania night. The red strobe lights flickered and died, replaced by the steady, humdrum glow of the emergency ballasts. I stayed on the floor for a long time, watching that scar. It didn't move. It didn't throb. It was just a weird, ugly patch on a basement wall. When the sun finally broke through the storm clouds, turning the sky into that bruised purple I'd seen before, I climbed out of the depths. I walked past the desk with the unplugged phone. I walked past the supervisor's office. Miller was standing there, a cup of lukewarm coffee in his hand. He looked at my torn shirt, the red welts on my chest, and the grey foam dried on my hands. He didn't ask what happened. He just nodded. "You did the work," he said, his voice like gravel. "The dam is satisfied." I went to my car, but I didn't drive home. I sat in the parking lot, looking at the massive concrete wall of the dam, holding back the weight of the river and the things that lived beneath it. I realized I could never leave. The marks on my chest, they weren't just scars. They were a signature. The cold was inside me now. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the pressure of the water. I could hear the faint, distant whistle of the thing behind the wall, waiting for the next time someone forgot to follow the rules. I am the witness now. I am the seal. And as long as I stay, as long as I watch the monitors and ignore the phone, the world stays dry. The river stays in its bed. And the abyss stays behind the concrete. I work at a dam in Pennsylvania. The rules are strange, but they are necessary. Because the moment we stop listening to the silence is the moment the water starts to taste like rot. I looked at the plastic-coated card in my hand one last time before throwing it into the river. I don't need the rules anymore. I know the rhythm of the dam. I know the hunger of the void. And I know that tonight, at 1:13 a.m., I'll be back in that chair, waiting for the phone to not ring.